Welcome to the Squelch and Boot. What can I do for you? You want information? Everyone wants information when they first come here. Everyone's always afraid. At least that's what they tell me. Alright. I'll tell you the basics. You gotta buy a drink though. Alright, fair's fair. What can I say? Shawfield's sort of been here forever. There's been a town in Shawfield since the days of the ancient kings, at the very least. The way I heard it, and you mind you, it's only the way I heard it, is that back in the day, not your grandpappy's day either, I mean a real long time ago, there was a couple of kings, and they were arguing with each other about maps and whatnot. They were drawing out all the borders. And as they were arguing about all the important bits, well, nobody really took into account that there was sort of a fen here, nobody cared. So each king was like, well, I'll just take that. Nothing came of it. Right, that's the way my grandpappy said. Nothing came of it, not for quite a while. Then you get 3, 4, I don't know how many kings later, and somebody goes, "Oi, well, there's a little fen over here, let's build a small town here." And they do that, and the other king goes, "Why, what are you doing? You're building a town in my fen." First king looks at him and goes, "Oh, no, that's not how that goes. That's my fen. I built a town in my fen, and you're telling me that it's yours, and that's not right and proper. I've got a map, see? And my map says the fen belongs to me. It's my grandpappy's map. You ought to believe it." Well, the other king goes and he says, "Oh, no. I've got a map, my grandpappy's map, and it says right over here, the fen belongs to me." Well, now, this is the sort of point where you and me, we'd go and say to each other, "All right, maybe we ought to split the fen right down the middle or something like that. Maybe there's a stream running through it that we can use to go and sort of size it out in a decent way between regular folk." You got to remember, these are ancient kings, lordly men. They were right and ready to scrap over it, even though it was effectively a worthless bog. So, what do? They send their people and they say, "Oh, you take that fen from that other bastard. Because he says on his map it's his, and it ain't the case, it's ours. So you go out there and you kill people until you solve this problem." Where they insert people out there, and their people fought over it, and they did a bunch of dying and whatnot, and nobody won. And the kings were like, "Well, that's not good, that didn't resolve our problem. What about a round 2? "Oh yeah, round 2's a great idea." So they went out there and they fought again. Well, they didn't win this time either. What about third time's a charm? "Oh yeah, that's a good idea." They fought a third time and a fourth time, and they did this for a real long time, and they were getting real pissy at each other, as they want to do when you're a king and you're not getting what you want. So they began hiring all sorts of people, mummers and priestly men and wizards and sorcerers and warlocks and all that other jazz, right? They got them all, and they threw them at each other and said, "Oh, you get me that bog." And the bog got all sorts of potions poured into it, got all sorts of spells sunk deep into the peat over many years and many kings, and they sort of forgot, at least my grandpappy says they sort of forgot, why they was even fighting. All they knew, you got to fight over the fen. That's how it's been, that's how it's always been. Unfortunately for them, there's only so much magic you can pour into one poor old fen before things begin to go a bit pear-shaped. In this case, the pear was a rotten person, because it got to the point where if something died in that fen, well, it wouldn't be dead for long, but it wouldn't come out quite right either. Sort of like Marge and her pies. Don't tell her I said that. She'll kill me. When things began to come out of the fen, well, people realised things had gotten a bit out of control. And both the kings looked at it and said, "Oh, scupper that. I'm not getting near that." And they pulled their people out and said, "No more going into the fen. It's a bad idea. Look what those bastards on the other side did." And they found better ways to disagree about things in the future. But see, the problem is, once you get a problem like that up, right, It's a real bummer to stop, because there's thousands and thousands of dead people stuck down there, and they've got a real nasty habit of climbing out, going looking for a bit of a munch, grabbing something, or someone, dragging them back to the fen, pulling them under, and now you got 2 bodies. And that's not good for anybody, except for the 2 that are in there. So, the undead keep on pouring out, and people are going, oh, this is not a great time. They stole my cow, they stole my wife, it's a bad lot. So eventually, well, there was a town set up, what to provide safe passage through the fence, and that's when Shawfield comes into being, and we've been here ever since. But we've expanded our enterprises, we have. We no longer just guide lucky cusses like you through to the other side. No, we also tend to the fen, and we harvest what's good from it. But what do you mean what's good from it? Hey, necromancers would pay top silver indeed for some of the bones coming out of this stuff. Also, nobody else knows where you don't go and where you do go, not like we do. That's a good service right there. We earn a decent living wage, we do. Now, I won't have you here otherwise. Not from anyone in this town, at least. Strangers might pass through and get all odd about it. Us a bit of bones, nothing to worry about. Were you looking for passage? Oh, it's easy done. Do it every day. It's not a problem. See you right through. I'd say check out the board. Notice of passing happening all the time. Not that sort of passing. You're not going to die. I promise you, it's a walk through the fen. It's not a big deal. We do it. Children do it. You'll be... Look, I know, it's scary when things crabble around outside the light of the fire and all that's stopping you from getting dragged off and torn up into little bitty pieces is some thin, glowing skein. But we know our craft. We're proud fen walkers. We've been doing this for hundreds of years. Our grandpappies were doing this, and we know our way around. We'll see you safe through. That I promise. All right? Yeah, well, see you in the morning. And that is the lore blurb for Shawfield, our first town on a walk about the town. I'm Kellendir from Kellendir's Corner, and the town that we are exploring today is Shawfield, a stilt town built atop a fen, where the dead are not quite so quiet, and there are quite a few of the dead to contend with, but where the townsfolk, shall we say, don't make bones about it. So where shall we begin? Well, our illustrious tavern keeper was decently correct about the history of Shawfield. The ancient kings, maybe not. Who really knows? Let those bygones be mostly bygones. But magic, old and wild and powerful, and ill-cautiously designed, did seep deep into the peat, and ran down to the hard minerals that lie deep below the fen. And they've seeped in and stuck there. And it is true that things that die near Shawfield, things that die on the old fen, well, they don't stay dead for very long. They come back. With a vengeance, but a vengeance well contained and managed by the folk of Shawfield. So, where is Shawfield geographically? Geographically speaking, Shawfield is going to lie on a fen. What is a fen? Well, it's a type of boggy, marshy area. It is oftentimes low-lying because you need that water table to be right up close to the ground level to have all these patches of effectively bog and marsh in between some elevated spots, which have, generally speaking, like long reeds and grasses, not sort of an overgrown bayou-like swamp, more so something you might see in various low-lying areas in England or occasionally dotting areas in Scotland where the water table creeps up really high. And the fen here, near Shawfield, well, this is going to be a high fen. Why? Because it's cool. And a couple of things we're going to do with that later. So, geologically speaking, we have a very, very high and hard and relatively continuous layer of rock and clay. and other relatively impermeable material that separates out that upper rock strata. Like the first 20 feet below that, very difficult to pass. Maybe there's some cracks and runnels and whatnot, and water can leach through. And then, bam, there's a second area of bedrock, or maybe just this incredibly old compacted layer of mineral-rich clay that is just preventing most water from seeping through, at least not quickly enough to prevent it from running up to the point where the water table is just resting right below the ground. We have our fen. So, in all these ancient wars, right, people are dying and dropping in here. We need the fen to have been around for a very long time, because otherwise we don't have the fen for people to fight over in the first place, and we don't have the dichotomy of, oh hey, these kings are fighting over something that is effectively useless, and there's that trope of, this was never worth the fight in the first place. However, politics and tradition built this fight into a generational feud, as we so often see in our own world's history. So that's where Shawfield is located geographically. The areas around Shawfield have to shift a bit to accommodate it. We could either say that, no, the fen just got there by magic. Ancient magic incident, a wizard fused the ground. But that's... don't really like that. So, what are we going to do? Shawfield itself lies on the leeward side of some sloping mountains. And the mountains are on the inland side. You have a slope, we have Shawfield and the fen, the old fen, and then you have coast, a ways away. So the fen ends, there are tributaries and rivers and whatnot running from the fen across more standard ground with more broken up water chambers where things lie a bit deeper below the surface, and they run out to the sea, and this is how the water leaves the old fen. Because the water needs to leave somehow, otherwise it's just all going to flood. It eventually has to find a way out. And our way out here is going to be those rivers that wind their way away from the old fen, down over to the coast, and output into the ocean. Okay. So we know why Shawfield exists. We know where it exists. How did it get its name? Well, Shawfield, from scrimshaw, the art of bone carving and bone crafting, something which is practiced quite commonly here, for reasons we shall get into. What do people do in Shawfield, and how many people are there? Well, we're going to pick a relatively arbitrary number. I'm going to say 530 some odd souls make up the residency of the town, and it's not a bunch of spread towns either. Shawfield itself is a large central community. Stilts go and elevate the various buildings off the ground. Though, interestingly enough, unlike many stilt villages that we see in our world, this one actually has a built-up palisade around it, because they have to worry about the undead rising. And the ground beneath the village itself is littered with holy symbols that people have allowed to sink deep into the peat to inure anything that dies in the village proper from coming back to haunt you, well, literally. So we have a stilt village of 530 folk. What do they do? You have the average professions. We have to have people who go and tend to various basic needs, fletchers, bowyers, a blacksmith. And when I say blacksmith, oftentimes we think of this fantasy connotation of the village smith who can turn out a masterwork sword. Not the case. A humble man who is decently skilled with the working of iron, especially bog iron, because, well, it's right there in the area. But definitely not somebody who knows much of arms and armor. More so somebody who is, frankly, more often a farrier shoeing horses and mules and whatnot than actually making anything even vaguely akin to a sword. Now, we're not going to have a large farming community here either. It's a fen, and we could go that route, where there's some magical way that they farm the fen itself in a way that is not replicated very strongly in our own world's history. But I think we're not going to go that way. They import their wheat, for example, right? Any of their cereals, wheat, barley, rye, so on and so forth, these things that require a dry period towards the end of their growing cycle, they're not growing any of that natively. That's all being shipped in. But we can add rice. They do grow rice natively. And they harvest many herbs out in the fens themselves. They may have some fruit trees. Realistically, apples and whatnot are a very good thing to add in here, and so we shall. We'll say there's small green shrub-like apple trees that they cultivate. The tart apples, often preserved. They're not very sugary, and they are quite tart. They're often mixed with sugars from beets and whatnot, and turned into preserves and jams that will help see the village folk through the various seasons, parts of the season, I should say, when the trees are dormant and not fruiting. The climate itself is relatively gentle, being relatively close to the coastline. There's so much ambient water. It's not a terribly far northern latitude, we'll say. So their winters are very gentle, and they'll get some frosting upon the fen, but nothing really ever freezes, and it's very rare that they get some heavy snowfall, which is good. They really don't need any more treachery out in the fens. So, not many normal farmers, but they do have a large number of apiarists, people who take care of bees. There are many wondrous and magical herbs out in the swamps, rare, hidden things that for a human would be rather difficult to find, but for bees, easy pickings. Apiarists make a great addition here because honey is incredibly valuable. We can make our mead, we can use it in salves and tinctures and potions. It's also a very good product to trade, and the flowers that the bees go and use when they make their honey, masticating it all up, then spitting it out to be refined into honey, right? The lovely bee spit that we so cherish. The flavor of the honey directly correlates to what the bees used to get their bee spit. That bee spit, in this case, is coming from rare herbs and spices, more than 11 of them. That's a trade commodity right there. That will bring people into the town. How do they get into the town? Well, we'll need to make a road, but that's going to be a special little thing that we will attend to a little later, because it ties into some other aspects of the town. So, we have our apiarists as a standout profession, fishmongers and fishers. Generally speaking, in a town of about this size, most of them are going to be this one and the same. Families go and they trap eels and fish, and we might have like pike and barracuda and whatnot in some areas, depending upon exactly where we have transitions between freshwater and saltwater, how close to the coast. So we'll say a pike-like or gar-like fish, long, lean, dangerous, huge, nasty, aggressive teeth. You really don't want to get on the bad side of one of these things, but the locals know how to fish them relatively safely. Eels are absolutely going to be very common, and they really fit the setting. And they were eaten very commonly in medieval times, especially in England, which is kind of where some of this inspiration is coming from. So we really do have a strong basis here for some of the foods that they're pulling from the swamp. We can also, interestingly, do something else that I'm going to show you, and that is swap to an odd food source. Snails. Large snails. Huge river snails. And don't get me wrong, some river snails in our world grow to be decently large, but I'm talking like watermelon-sized hunking snails. Huge things, slow, and poisonous if you don't prepare them correctly, but the village folk do know how to blanch them so that they are no longer a dangerous, toxic, unfortunate mess, and are in fact a local delicacy. And probably spurs the importation of white wine. Something that they're not really going to have here. They might have berry wines grown from various berries in the swamp, but actual vineyards, we're not going to get that in a fen. So now we have imports and exports, but we haven't gotten to the main import and export. The main import is ultimately going to have to be either medicinal materials that they don't have access to here because of their activities in their main profession, could be metal. Bog iron is a thing. If we choose to make it plentiful within the fens, great. If we don't, they'll need to bring it in. And their major export is bone. The bone of long fallen soldiers, steeped in the old magics of the land. And to this end, a large portion of the adult workforce are fenwalkers. People who have a decent knowledge of scrimshaw and herbcraft and maybe a little bit of magic, some witchcraft and whatnot. They're hedge mages at best. These are, generally speaking, not like terribly powerful magic users. It wouldn't make sense based upon the context that we're dealing with here, this small rustic town. If we gave terribly powerful magic users the run of the place, well, things might change rather swiftly. Maybe it becomes much more important economically and begins to bloom in size. Though you can have a powerful mage or two hiding here if there is a particular thing that they are on the run from and have decided, ooh, this lovely little town here is exactly the right place to hide because nobody will suspect that I, the great mage Oravizo, would go and stoop so low as to consign myself to living amongst a bunch of these hedge wizards, barely worthy of the name. Potential interesting plot point there. So, how do we get the balance here between the fen is dangerous, these people work the fen their entire lives and are decently blasé about it? We can balance a couple of different traits. How worried are they about death doesn't necessarily have to do with how often people die. That's a cruel but very real fact. Historically, there have been workforces and areas where death was really common, and people generally shook it off after a while. Humans are incredibly adaptable and can normalize even pretty terrible situations. That's one way to go, but it wouldn't quite match the tone that I set up earlier in the lore blurb. So we're going to shift this slightly differently. Instead, the Fenwalkers use a blend of skills from alchemy to witchcraft to a little bit of wizardry to go and walk the fens with relative impunity, to the point where, generally speaking, deaths out on the fens, sometimes they are horrible accidents and tragedies, but more often it is personal human error that leads to death. And the villagers all shake their heads and go, I could have told him. I knew that was going to happen and he didn't listen. I shouldn't have trusted a skein that old. What's a skein? I mentioned it earlier when I thought it up. Well, a skein is a bundle of woven thread. Well, technically it's a rod that you wind the thread around and can go into all sorts of weaving apparatuses. Apparati, we'll say. Cool word for a hank of yarn, effectively. And this is custom made, woven perhaps with some silver. Ooh, now we have a reason why their lucrative bone trade is being consumed. They need some relatively expensive materials to make the equipment that they use to traverse the fen safely. Well, now we have inflows of money. They sell very valuable bones. Necromancers and wizards and other magic users go, yes, I wanted dead people bones from yay year. Oh, what a lovely vintage. So they pay top dollar, or top gold coin in this case, for those bones. Make no bones about it. But we can balance this and make sure that the village doesn't grow too rapidly by saying, that's fine, but you now need to buy a lot of silver and platinum and sulfur and whatever other compounds they wind up needing that they can't get themselves to be safe out on the fen. Let's throw in some other interesting bits of lore. Maybe the bones can't be exposed to sunlight before they're preserved. Maybe they're lacquered. That's cool. What are we going to do to make this a little bit spicier? Moonlight. Moonlight is instrumental in determining the quality of the bones. When they disinter someone from deep within the fen, they do it on a night with enough moonlight to channel through some lenses and use some of their hedge magic to read the bones. Maybe they have like patches that adorn their robes, right? They can pull out a swath of cloth of different colors. So now we've made them need some dyes. Dyes are pretty expensive. But they have to get these colors right. And these are special pigments that match the right colors that the bone should have under the focusing lens during exposure to moonlight, and specifically moonlight. Well, this means their light sources, they can't just be normal torches, right? I mean, that would be too easy if we just, it's okay if there's also tons of torchlight. No. So they capture foxfire from wisps out upon the moors, a dangerous task in and of itself. The wisps seek to beguile you and lead you astray, and yet, the fenwalkers go and counter that beguilement. They use mirrors to reflect the wisp light and gently tease the wisps back through the trees and across the pools of water, and then trap them within a ring of torchlight. No. It's not just a standard torch. There are reagents that are used. Maybe it's a mixture. Maybe it's a titanium oxide or something, right? Or maybe it's copper, right? A metal that causes the fire to flare in an interesting color that the wisps cannot pass. There's some magical resonance problem, perchance, or potentially the wisps are frightened of it. Maybe they use magnesium or something, and they make something that is similar enough to sunlight through some clever alchemy on their part that what winds up happening is the wisps that are mortally afraid of the sunrise are encircled by an artificial sunrise, and the hunters close in, placing the staked torches closer and closer, right? Because the torches have to have enough you can stick them into the ground and have them stay there and not, fall over or get lost in the fen. They encircle the wisp, trap it, close it, and then subdue it. Perhaps some silver powder or something with a special ritual cast over it that many of the old biddy witches in the village know. They can carefully prepare this powder that goes and diminishes the wisp, and they capture the wisp, take it to the town, trap them in lanterns. Maybe this is the way that the town lights its streets, with captured wisps, and the flame, the foxfire that leaks off of the wisps is captured and then in turn used as a light source out on the fens so that they don't go and misread or pollute the bones that they are pulling up. Why are we laying out these complications for the central profession, the most pivotal profession, the one that defines the entire town? Because these complications give us story building opportunities, and because we need to match some basic premises. This town I have portrayed as being relatively humble, decently prosperous because of their rare trade, but they're not booming. This isn't, there aren't burgermeisters and whatnot living in lavish stilt houses of multiple stories and whatnot. This is still a somewhat humble village. And to do that, we need to balance that trade out. They're getting the gold, but they have to lose it somehow. And this is a way for them to lose some of that money in a fashion that it does not just make sense, but gives us a ton of lore and story building possibilities. So, as a natural outflow of disinterring these bones, storing them, they know how to lacquer them and preserve them for their necromancer clients and whatnot. And they trap wisps to get the light that enables them to go and do this, but they can't refine the glass themselves. They don't have the right sands. They don't have the right skills. They probably aren't able to make fires that are hot enough to make a glass furnace. So they have all these imports, so they're now balanced out economically speaking. So let's go and take that central profession and tack something onto it, right? The travel. Because if they need all these things from other places, they need to get them somehow. Towns, generally speaking, don't just pop out of nowhere. There's a reason. Well, we know the reason for this town. It's partially to control the undead population. That was the original reason. And now it's bustled up into this trade. Well, part of this is guiding people through the fens, as we saw in the lore blurb. That's very useful. But we also need a little bit more here. We don't need, but we want a little bit more here. And that little bit more can be how do people get into the town? The town might not be on the border. Maybe it's at a pretty central location in the fen, a relatively safe location, sure, but a relatively central one so that hunting parties can go out and all these fen walkers can find the best spots to be looking for the bones, and the guys who aren't too happy with being dead who are coming out so they can bop them over the head and whatnot, and, well, free bones right there. So, traders need to go and get to the town. We could go and say there's a road. That's one way to do it. There's an overgrown but tended road. It's overgrown simply because the fen is so vicious, fighting with its magic and its unholy will to try and corrupt the road and tear it apart. We could do that. And we will do that in other towns, but we're not going to do it here. I'm going to introduce something else, something a little bit more interesting. There's a stop-off point, a small ways station, before we get to the fen itself, where all the wagons stop. End of the road for wagons. You're not taking them further. From here on out, you have a couple of choices. You can go and head off by boat. Flat barges, very shallow draft, so they can actually, skim above in some of the real shallows. Now, this works, but this only works certain times of the year, only when the water levels are high enough. Maybe we'll give a third of the year over to rivercraft. For a third of the year, these incredibly shallow barges are the way to go. If you are going and shipping goods to or from Shawfield, this is what you want. Cool. That's awesome. Like, riverine travel is very well known. It's relatively secure if you have fen walkers there to guide you, right? You can have all sorts of interesting adventures or little areas where, these people decided to just go and hire a bunch of barges and not take fen walkers, and, they didn't make it. So, river travel, third of the year. Well, what do you do at the other parts? You don't just abandon trade. Trade is lucrative, especially when you're trading in rare dead people bones. You've got a couple of choices. You can take animals through the fen. Horses can swim. Horses can do decently well in water. But, as with most livestock, prolonged period in the damp degrades their legs. So the trips need to be made with a certain amount of speed, and now we can add some interesting little tidbits. Maybe there's a string of way stations, hillocks in areas that rise above the fen, other fields. Presumably, if it's, Shawfield, there's a field there. The field upon which they scrimshaw their bones and whatnot to make their wards and talismans and all that other joyous good stuff that protects them from the dangers of the fen. But that doesn't mean that's the only area which has a significant amount of dry land. Maybe there are other hillocks around, and you have way stations where you can go and either rest your animals, or potentially you have hired intermediaries who go and exchange animals at this point. They might have deals with the people who run the way stations. They might be an entrepreneur who has decided to open these way stations themselves, and they're now acting as a middleman. Let's actually go with that one. I like where this is going. We will follow this thread. Why? Because middlemen make for good conflict, and conflict is what we need in world building. Your characters are fundamentally influenced by their world. There is no way around that. Characters either react antithetically to something, like something affects them and they push back, or they go with it, or somewhere in between. There's always going to be that range and that dichotomy. This tension between a character and their world gives them so many of their traits, and is a really excellent way to characterize things, whether it's a D&D character or somebody in a novel. If we have a middleman, let's say a son of a noble who is 6th, 7th, 8th in line, he's not getting anywhere without so much backstabbing that he decided, this just isn't worth it. I'm not doing this. And he went and set up shop here as a middleman who goes and has people who guide the animals along these routes. And he pays fenwalkers to accompany them and keep them safe on the trip. And the horses are not exposed to the wet and damp for too long, right? They don't get thrush. They don't get all these nasty swamp-borne diseases in their hooves, which can kill them if not treated. And he is able to ship goods the other 2/3 of the season when the boats are not available. So maybe, and this is nice, right? We can now go back here and say, hey, it used to be in the past that only that 1/3 of the season was trade open. And they had to really rush and push because they needed those river boats. And so the barges just were flowing back and forth. And all the fenwalkers were super taxed during this period. And you had almost like a frantic season of trading. And then you had the calm seasons. And now with this more constant trade, thanks to this entrepreneur, things have slowed down. And this also explains why the fenwalkers just haven't crushed this guy. Because he's cutting into their profits, right? There's no way around that. He is a middleman. He is chopping away their profits, but they are also getting things. They're getting a more relaxed schedule. It's more consistent work. Well, that's not bad. This person also bought and invested in tons of livestock that they could not have invested in, especially because living in the middle of the fen, they don't really have much acquaintance with livestock. We might give them pigs because pigs are super ubiquitous everywhere. We might give them various amphibians. That would be very cool. Yeah, let's not even go with pigs. Let's give them a bunch of amphibians that they farm because that is cool and not like something we really have in our world. Maybe we have something like those truly giant like newts and salamanders that you get in Japan, where there's, it's a TV show and it's like, oh, look at this, 800, 1,000 some odd pound salamander that this guy just wrestles out of a tub or something. It's like, what the hell is that? That could eat a baby. That's what I'm talking about. Like 6-foot, chunky, meaty, tender salamanders with lovely little frills. And the townsfolk raise them, and sometimes they're kept as pets, but mostly they are livestock, and they are raised and then slaughtered, and they provide a ton of food, and let's say they taste actually quite nice. Yeah, let's give them the taste. Let's make this nice. Cool. We now have their central livestock there in Shawmill. Nice. Generally speaking, you either want to go and say, we're not going to emphasize livestock. We're just going to sort of shunt it aside. Maybe somebody has some pigs, some goats, some whatever, but we're not really going to have a focus there. It's going to be an aside thing. Oh, this family has a milk cow. Or you want to specify livestock. Because generally speaking, at lower tech levels, livestock really have either a pivotal role or they're just kind of on the periphery. A great instance of this is if we look at most of the Middle Ages, literally, effectively, all of the Middle Ages in England, pigs. It's all pigs. Because you can't go hunting, it's poaching, right? That's going to lead to some real problems. And if they catch you, maybe if you lose a hand, you're lucky. That's not necessarily true. Laws were very different depending on the time. That being said, you could be just killed outright. You could be lashed pretty badly. It really depends. But none of it was pleasant. So, goats. Yeah, some people had goats, right? Some areas had goats. But pigs were ubiquitous. Even people in cities in the Middle Ages in England had pigs because they were so easy to care for. They could live off of a lot of your food scraps. They grew relatively fast and they provided a ready source of meat. And they also weren't seen as unfortunate as cows were. Cows were seen as a bad animal to eat medicinally, which is interesting. It's one of the reasons why you mostly see like dairy cattle in the Middle Ages. Now, oxen are actually different because remember, this is medieval medicine. It's more about symbology than anything else. So keep that in mind. And we can make our symbology whatever we want here. So these lovely large salamanders, oh, these people love them. And that's going to be our main livestock here. Cool. Hides from the salamanders are, we'll say, incredibly water resistant. Now we have a form of leather that they can make locally because why have them go and ship externally for leather amongst all these other things? And maybe they ship some of it. Maybe when your adventurers go over to this town, this amazing waterproof leather that maybe it also resists acid as well. That's a cool property, right? It's very difficult to corrode. Lovely stuff. Now we have yet one more property that makes this town a little bit special, a little bit interesting, but isn't going to skew or unbalance anything or really wreck our world building. Nice. So, back to this entrepreneur. He's a middleman, and there's a balance there between the irritation that this man is skimming off our profits, but also he makes our lives easier, so it's not like we really want to come after him, especially because the townsfolk don't necessarily have the expertise to take care of the animals. But wait, just because they don't have the expertise doesn't mean they don't think they have the expertise. And now we have a conflict, a lovely conflict, right? What people are actually capable of has nothing to do with what they think they are capable of. And oftentimes when people know very little about a subject, they then go and think to themselves, it can't be that hard. I could do that. They're just animals. We take care of these giant salamanders. It'll be fine. So we will make a faction in the village, not led by the innkeeper. Well, he's stable. He likes outside influences. He likes getting the fancier alcohols. No, we'll choose the cobbler. There's probably a couple of cobblers in town. We'll say the largest cobbler, the shoemaker, is the head of this movement that really wants to shut this entrepreneur down. Why? Well, there's a kind of symbolic sense here. This cobbler shoes people in the waterproof leather of the salamanders. If anybody ought to think that they can solve the problem of the horses going lame as they wander through the wet and damp for too long, it may very well be this guy. So, we get to choose the level of resentment, right? How long has this festered? Maybe we add a personal conflict to it as well. Maybe he has seen specific unfortunateness here. Maybe, okay, here's an idea. What if the salamander hide can't be tanned using brain tanning or any of the normal chemical or alchemical solutions available on this world? Maybe there is a special need for an earth, right? Like a red volcanic earth. It's relatively rare, it's relatively expensive, and a lot of it... Actually, no, let's change that, right? I stumbled into a little bit of a mistake there. We'll go over the next video. We'll swap this over. We'll say it requires a calcium-rich silt, which has the right alchemical properties from much further up the coast than around this area. And it needs to be carried in large quantities. And so this young entrepreneur, this noble, doesn't want to carry the clay. Like the weight to profit really isn't there for him. He could try and raise the price, and then, well, this cobbler and all the other cobblers, at that point, they just wait, right? They go back to doing the old thing. They just wait for the boats, which can bear the clay much more easily. So he has no incentive to carry this stuff. Weight, lots of mess, hard to make a profit off of. Why would he do that? He's not going to, at least not in this case. And this has really irked the lead cobbler off. Ticked him off, I should say. Or just irked him and have left it there. English. So, now that we've set up this conflict here, this is where the adventurers come in. This is where, as a writer, right, this comes into the novel. And this ties into the world building so well because we've shaped it to the town. It's part and parcel of the fabric of the world. We have a native conflict brewing in Shawfield that has nothing to do with the dangers of the fen itself, which is what we will go and explore next. Because the fen is not without its very real dangers. We can go a very traditional route, right? Dungeons and Dragons would simply go and stuff like a black dragon or two, right? Acidic swamp dragons in the fen. Yes, sure, why not? Undead wizards, right? Like a lich or something. Super classical, super standard. Druids. Nasty, angry swamp druids. Could be fun. Could be very fun. Alternatively, potentially, things can get a little bit more convoluted here. Things get a little bit more interesting here. What if some of the dead that are rising are not in fact mindless anymore. What if the dead they've been pulling up are the more recent ones, right? We have stratification of bones, corpse stratification, if you will, throughout the Fen. They've been pulling up and dismembering and selling off the younger, newer undead who don't have well-formed minds. And there are other undead who spent quite a long time beneath the peat before they eventually crawl their way out. And some percentage of them will say, have achieved some sort of equilibrium. They've had their nirvana moment. They've gone and become Zen undead, and they're like, peace with the world, or at least no need to ravenously go after people meat. Cool. That's nice, right? Actual thinking undead. They're not human anymore. Maybe they don't have as wide an emotional palette. Maybe right? You can fit this to whatever undead you decide to work with in your story. But these undead, well, they're pretty pissed because I just pulled myself out of the bog and I saw my friend Pete get dragged away with silvered ropes that burned him and then dismembered while I hid in a bush. He's screaming and begging for help. Nobody's listening to him. Why is nobody listening? Well, maybe the modern Fenwalkers don't even speak these ancient languages and have no clue that what this creature is shrieking is actual pleas for help, right? This could legitimately be a real misunderstanding. And they're like, oh man, it's so horrible to see what's happened to this poor thing. Let's cut it down quickly. Let's get this over with. We'll put it out of its misery. You can have honest intentions here with great world building and still have this secondary conflict. And so these intelligent undead are getting pissed and pissed and pissed. And they know that the further down in the peat you go, there are some pretty tough customers down there. There's that warlock. Remember that warlock? Yeah, the Battle of 82. Oh man, that guy laid out like 50 people flat, single spell. When he gets up here, we're gonna go and we're gonna tell him exactly what happened, and we'll see what happens to these stupid villagers. Perfect conflict brewing. One that can go so many different ways. And one that as a DM or a novelist or a game designer, you can split, right? To have a number of different endings, depending upon what you need, if it's a novel, or what your players do, if it's an adventure. And if you guys are interested in me making a small module for this, right? Walking you guys through how you'd make those quests for, let's say, a pen and paper setting, get in the comments. That should be a question. That should be a request. So get down there and you begin typing. So we have a secondary conflict, right? Currently, these intelligent undead are too weak to do all that much, but not for long, right? When the nastier undead begin to come up, well, suddenly they will be a force to be reckoned with. And even though these villagers in Shawfield have a certain expertise in dealing with the undead, they're not ready for some of these ancient warriors. And maybe the town priest knows about this. Ooh. Maybe Joachim. Yeah, that's a good name for him. Joachim is an old scholar, a bit of a recluse, but people like him. He's ministered to births. He's helped those who are sick. He's generally respected. Maybe he understands what's going on. Maybe he's here because he wants something. Maybe it's for his religious order. There's an artifact buried down there. One of those stronger undead has something he needs. And he's been waiting for a decade, 2 decades, however long it takes for him to get that. And maybe he's trying to enlist adventurers. And maybe, well, probably he's not going to tell them the truth. And it's up to the adventurers to figure out exactly why he knows so much about what's going on here as things begin to take a curious twist. So, we've covered some of the who's who, right? Different potential factions and conflicts that could arise here in Shawfield. Some very interesting stuff here. Let's go on to military, because we're talking about a bunch of potential conflicts. What are the military forces like around here? Well, the answer is weird. Shawfield itself probably only has a militia. Realistically, are brigands going to go into the undead-infested swamp and lose a ton of people because they are not specialized at hunting undead for a living, literally farm. It doesn't really make a ton of sense. Even if brigands go and capture the town, there's no necessary reason why they would retain the expertise of the townsfolk, which wouldn't stop them from trying, because remember, people can be very, very stupid. But it could potentially stop them from succeeding in a very big way. So, what does the militia consist of? Well, you almost certainly have a ton of people who aren't spell swords, because they only have like basic militia drills, which means probably polearms, which make a lot of sense. You want something to lean on in the fen. You want to be able to guide a small skiff or whatnot. It makes a lot of sense that spears are a very common thing. In fact, actually, let's swap this out, because we have a very interesting option here. Tridents and forks. Why? Well, because all these undead are coming out, and you can have a bunch of burly people going, and they have a bunch of these tridents, and they stick the undead, tangle up the tines and clothing and bones and flesh, and pin the undead, while somebody else goes and wraps silvered ropes about the creature so they can drag it off and, harvest it more safely somewhere else. Right? So cool. We have a good reason for these people to be very invested in the use of tridents and forks and man catchers and whatnot. And now they are going to go and use these weapons even when they face off against other humans, and they already have the teamwork down. So when you face off against these guys, it's not mano y mano, I'm fighting you from the village. It's, I'm fighting you. Hey, why are you poking me? What are you doing? Oh, give me my arm back. They're going to go, and 3 of them are going to converge on you with their tines and forks and whatnot, and they're going to stab you and stick you and drag you down to the ground while another person finishes you off. So these villagers are going to want to ambush, and they're going to want to have numeric superiority, which works really well if they're facing off against an adventuring company. They should also have a smattering of minor magics, mostly aimed at undead, which means they're probably not going to be packing many offensive spells that hurt people, but they might have some simple healing, they might have great ability to cure diseases and whatnot, and they might have a bunch of nature-like spells, right? Things that allow them to traverse through the fen much more swiftly than normal people might. All these minor magics, many of them might be bound up in bone talismans, Scrimshawed, hence the name of the town, right? We're connecting back to the lineage of the town and the reason why these people have been able to get away with what they're doing for so long and why they are so good at their job. Maybe the bone talismans are mostly non-reusable. Maybe you need to snap them for them to work. Right? Now we have another draw on the bones. This means they can't just endlessly stockpile them and have this ludicrously powerful bone arsenal, or at least it makes it harder to do so because they use their bone amulets in their day jobs, and they go and have to break them to get the magic to work. Maybe they're not, right? They're not necromancers. They're not as sophisticated, magically speaking. They can't call power from the bones or channel it through the bones. They need to break the bones to actually get the spell to work. That's how they trigger the magics that they store deep within their various bone amulets and trinkets. And it's very important that we do that. Otherwise, well, there's the potential for, oh yeah, we're just storing up all these, bone amulets of horrible blight disease, and when we're ready to go and attack some people, we're just going to crack open a bunch of these and point the severed ends at whoever we don't like, and that person's just going to be retching and spewing blood into the fen. They're not going to be fighting us. Good times. So we want to cut down on that. So now we have a pretty good understanding of what the townsfolk are mostly doing. They're skirmishers, they entangle people, they have a smattering of magics, mostly designed to combat undead, mostly relatively low power stuff, but their ambush tactics and their ability to maneuver through the fen faster than effectively everybody else makes them really dangerous in that environment. We then add the various poisons and whatnot that hedge witches and wizards might have, and the small spells, and the curses, especially the curses, and you really don't necessarily want to tangle with these people in their home. And it also means they're not nearly as effective outside of their home, which helps contain them and make sure that their ambitions don't stray. Good stuff. That entrepreneur that we're talking about, we'll just name him Fender. Why not? Maybe it's a shortened version of his formal name, we'll say. Fenderonimus or whatever. Who cares? What's his armed forces looking like? Well, probably just a personal guard or two. The Fenwalkers are taking care of security on the trips, and the caravans that come to him have guards. He just needs enough muscle to make it not worth people's while to steal from him. The Fenwalkers aren't going to do it because with him gone, well, most of them realize things aren't going to go well for them. They're going to go back to the old way where they're going and having just this horribly rushed third of the year that's really bad for everybody. And when people are rushed, they make mistakes and more Fenwalkers die, and it's a bad deal. However, we do have that one faction led by the Cobbler who might be willing to risk it. So our entrepreneur here might need to hire some muscle in the future, potentially some adventurers. So, or the heroes of the story or whatnot. So he's not really a contender here. Well, what about the undead? We can give them a whole bunch of interesting, intelligent undead now. I mean, the actual undead that are normally roaming about the fen and are being harvested, they don't actually matter all that much. We can give them some interesting, unique abilities, like the armor. Maybe they're using bronze armor. Maybe the wars were that ancient that even the people they're digging up at the upper layers, maybe they're using... Maybe initially they were going through iron and it was so corroded that there was effectively no armor on the undead. And now they're beginning to get into bronze, which is one of the things that's hearkening, right, onto this delving into a lower level of undead who are more powerful. Now we're getting bronze armor, which hasn't corroded nearly as much, is way more intact in the low oxygen of the peat, maybe because people even back then used something similar to the salamanders. The leather used in the armor didn't degrade, so it's actually almost fully functional. And suddenly you have armored undead, which is in and of itself a major upgrade. And now we have all these old undead heroes that you can stat out like player characters if you're going for a pen and paper setting, or in your novel, you can give them whatever abilities, you would personally lend to powerful undead, which, by the way, there will definitely be a video on powerful undead and why and how we want to restrict certain abilities and enhance certain others, and what exactly can challenge players, and what exactly can make the undead a bit more of an ominous force for readers. And that will definitely be something in the works. Or, well, it is currently in the works, not out yet. So, we now have a pretty good grasp on the military situation around here in the terms that we need for the story thus far. So, we have our politics, we have our military, right? We've got our trade, we've got our geography. We have ourselves a number of central figures and people who are deriving these factions, because ultimately when we're setting up these people, what do we need? People with wants and the will to get them. That's what we are looking for. And that's what we have now. So, those are the basic statistics, if you will, for the village of Shawfield. A lovely, stilt village out in a very, very unfortunate fen. I hoped you guys loved that little adventure into this small town that I just thought up. And yeah, it was very fun to make. Hopefully it was as fun to watch. And please, all of your questions about the town, all the things you want to know, and if you want me to go and elucidate further on any particular point, write it down below. Feel free to like and subscribe if you thought that was worthwhile content, if you thought that the getting into the nitty-gritty of this was actually worth your time as a DM, a novelist, a game designer, or whatnot. And remember that the second video will be coming out tomorrow, the day after that or so, where I'm going to be going through each piece and portion and delving even more deeply into this. Like, hey, horses don't do well here. Well, why? I'm going to explain a little bit more about that. Though there is a video on horses under the traveling section of this channel. So how to get there is what that will be titled. How to get there horses, where we will go into the basics of what you need to understand about horses for a fantasy setting, and where we're going to be covering all other forms of fascinating travel through realms, both fantastical and science fiction. However, this has been an absolute blast, and I hope that you as always, are kind and clever, and that everything unfortunate does not befall you, and all of your fortunes are multiplied, and may you have a wonderful, just absolutely wonderful rest of your day. See you guys.